was easier to stand at the Old Bailey and get 30 life sentences and 20 years. And it was also easier to plant bombs in London than stand here. I was going to say that, you know, religion and the practice of religion and religiosity doesn't come easily to someone like me, you know. I saw myself as like a manly sort of guy in Derry, and I saw myself as a follower in the footsteps of somebody like Patrick Pearse or somebody who didn't sit around and pray, but who went out and fixed things, you know, with guns and other guys and bombs. And when I was 15 in Derry, when I was 13 in Derry, I saw a lot of civil rights, I saw a lot of hurt, I saw a lot of beatings of Catholics and so on by police and army, and I was bitter. And I was at a good school, and my father was the headmaster of the Christian Brothers in Derry and so on. But I was bitter, and I thought, you know, as a choir boy in the cathedral, that there had to be more to my life than sitting around watching all this happening. And as for continuing to stay in my cathedral choir in Derry, I thought that was the greatest waste of time. So I went off at the age of 15 and joined the IRA, thinking it would change the world and free my country. And that was 1970. By 1972, we'd had the experience of Bloody Sunday in Derry, and I just happened by accident to be in the front row on Bloody Sunday of a civil rights demonstration, and I saw 13 people shot dead around me, and I saw others wounded and injured, guys in my class shot across the face with bullets, and you know, I was bitter and I was angry, and I thought the proper response here is to devote yourself to the IRA, learn your weaponry and learn your bomb making and so on, and go out and teach the Brits a lesson. And I certainly did everything I could from my 15th year to teach the Brits a lesson that I thought they would understand. So I planted many bombs around Derry, on the border, and I became the Derry Brigade Explosives officer. Not only did I plant the bombs and make them myself, but I trained many other people, my friends my age, to make the bombs and plant them, and to train other people. And after the Price sisters were arrested in London in '73, there was nobody there bombing, so I volunteered at the age of 18 to go to London alone, and at the time I would have thought, you know, bomb some sense into those Brit bastards. So off I went at the age of 18 with explosives and detonators, and I bombed London for a whole summer myself. And I invented letter bombs and sent them everywhere. Judges, generals, 10 Downing Street, you name it, you know. And I was a bit like Brenton Behan at the time. Brenton Behan said that he was a daylight atheist. He only ever got religious in the dark and when there was danger around. And that was my story. I wouldn't touch a Catholic church with a 40-foot pole because they hadn't the guts to support the IRA and their people. Nor would I touch with a 40-foot pole any churchman with a pair of rosary beads. So, anyway, I continued my bombing campaign, so on and so forth, and I was realizing all along the way, seeing myself on the high moral ground, that innocent people were getting injured. And I kept hearing this mobile phone going off or beeper going off, but I never answered it, you know. And that was a thing called conscience, which was constantly saying to me, you know, you're hurting people, you have injured people. Even people who are not your legitimate targets, you are hurting. But I wouldn't answer this mobile phone or this beeper because it was a pain, you know. And meanwhile, friends of mine were shot dead. They were blown up. They were killed by their own bombs. And you know, we'd be sitting around in the IRA thinking, you know, we have a mass. We have a friendly priest who will say the mass, and it must be the case that, in the same way that the Capuchin friars looked after the 1916 signatories who were executed and so on, there must be some mercy and support among church people and God for righting old wrongs and fighting for Ireland against the Brits and against the loyalists. And I assumed, without ever thinking about it, that you died for Ireland. Like in the PLO or whatever, you went straight to heaven, presumably. At least I certainly hoped so, but I didn't give it too much thought, except when I was in danger. And when I was frequently in danger, I would frequently pray, get me out of danger and I'll do anything you want, you know. It's like when you're on an airplane and you hit some turbulence. You know, you promise everything to this God figure. When you reach terra firma, you don't bother about it. Eventually I was arrested, and I ended up at the Old Bailey in London, and I was given 30 life sentences and 20 years. And the cops who arrested me hated me. The prison officers hated me as much as they hated the Birmingham 6 and Guildford 4, who were friends of mine. And many of the prisoners hated me. And I left the Old Bailey, and they said, "You'll never see Ireland again. You'll never be released." And I went went into worm with scrubs with the 30 life sentences and 20 years, and I refused to wear the criminal uniform because I was a political prisoner, I felt. And I was naked in solitary for about 14, 15 months. No exercise, no visits, nothing. You were locked up in a concrete tomb with a small window for about 14 and a half months. And I thought, I am a hero, this is the way to do it. Other people have done this, you know. And I had nothing in a cell but this mobile phone going off, i.e. my conscience. And some old Bible that I thought, you know, only fuddy-duddies would ever read a Bible. It means nothing to me. Protestants read Bibles, Catholics don't read Bibles. So anyway, lying in my solitary cell, I used to ask myself, you know, I've given my life up to the IRA. I was on the brigade staff, and I trained many people to be there also. And I only wanted one answer in solitary confinement. What is the truth, you know? Do you stay in the IRA for life? Do you stick with the IRA command? Do you live according to the IRA line? Or is it, you know, what happened to my friends who were blown up and shot dead and killed? You know, is there some big judgment out there, like a great fry-up of hamburgers when all souls like me would be fried up for all eternity? Is there some great judgment after death? Is there any hope? Is there any realism in it, or what? And I was searching around, and the only person I ever saw was a priest who was an English nationalist, just my luck. He was a Jesuit who believed that his passport should say English, not British. He hated Irish people then, and he hated the Birmingham Six and Co, and he hated me above all, because I would not bow the knee to the Brits and the prison system and so on. And he expressed his hatred now and again when he walked in the door of my cell, and I would tell him, F off, out of my cell. You know, this is the story of the crappy boy. So I'd have nothing to do with this English Jesuit guy. Anyway, one time in a short ceasefire in our relations in the prison, I was saying to him, you know, this God that you're supposedly serving while you're hating me, how did you get any information about him? Did he ever telephone anybody and say, I'm here? Did he ever leave any information, or did he ever leave any pointers? And he said, just read the gospel. That's all I would say to you, you know. So at the age of about 21, in solitary, naked, I thought, what is this gospel? Could hardly find it in the Bible. Found the 4 gospels and read them, you know, and I thought, I was really powerfully struck by an idealism of a JC that I'd never heard of. I got little bits at Mass every Sunday. I couldn't put the jigsaw together. You know, I wasn't very good at jigsaws anyway. But I found this idealism in this weird guy who, unlike me, had a divine cause, an innocent cause, a sacred cause, you know. He was right, and he did not turn to bombs. He did not turn to swords. He did not turn to whatever they had. He relied on something that you couldn't see. He was prepared to do what I was not prepared to do, really, which was die for a cause without ever hurting anybody, without ever blowing anybody up or shooting anybody. And this mobile phone that I had in my head, my conscience was really hurting me, you know. And if you understand that for many prisoners, IRA prisoners and others, nobody ever writes to them, nobody ever visits them, and in England at that time, people weren't allowed to visit IRA prisoners if they weren't members of their own family. So we were totally cut off, and I was totally cut off. Apart from this Bible, this priest who hated me, and reading the Gospels, you know, I was totally cut off. So anyway, my conscience was like a huge bomb on my shoulder, like a booby trap, you know, and I could get no ease. And I was reading the Gospels, and I was very struck by a weird line in there, you know, that said, if you come to the altar there to offer your gift, and remember, and if at that moment you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift before the altar. Go away and be reconciled with your brother first, and then come and offer your gift. And I thought, this is really weird, you know. There isn't a priest I know or a bishop I know who would tell you, don't come to this service or this liturgy. Go and be reconciled first and then come back. They want to get them in. They want to get bums on seats. And I'd never heard this line about be reconciled to your brother first and then come. And I could not bring myself to go to this English Jesuit priest who hated me and hated Irish people, to seek forgiveness, to talk about forgiveness, to talk about confession or reconciliation. I was not someone who would easily bow the knee to anybody. But anyway, I eventually talked to this priest who hated me, and I mean, he really hated me. You would see it up front, he would express it. And I said, you know, I feel great guilt. I want to attend. I want to believe in this God. I want to believe that there's something after this total mess of a life. I could be killed in here in prison any day of the week, and nobody will care. Stabbed to death, killed by prison officers who beat me up. They often came into the cell and tore up sheets and said, hang yourself, you Irish bastard. This is the only way you're going to get out of here, in a box. So I thought, you know, I could die any time. Where's my insurance? What comes next? Is there any information on it? And I wanted to take part in this sacrament of reconciliation, forgiveness. I wanted to be forgiven. But I felt that I couldn't be. I felt that, I couldn't go through this English Jesuit priest who hated me. I wouldn't bow the knee to him, and he wouldn't bow the knee to me either. And I heard this line, be reconciled to your brother first before you come to all these sacraments and stuff. And I said, how the hell can I do that? And eventually it struck me that I should write to the people I injured with letter bombs and others. I should write to them and say, look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. It was wrong. I should have supported civil rights and human rights and not trashed them. And I led myself and others up the garden path. And we are lost here. So eventually I fought the Home Office for a year for the right to write to people and say sorry. They didn't want any IRA prisoner saying sorry because it gave these prisoners some moral status at last, and they didn't want it. They did everything they could to prevent me saying sorry, but eventually I won the right to say sorry, and I wrote to these victims and said sorry, and 2 million cubes of, lead lifted off my shoulders. But still, I hadn't come near the church as such, because the only person I had representing the church was this guy who hated Irish people, and he really hated me. And eventually I said to him, if I'm a hypocrite in wanting to be Catholic but having bombed people, you're a bigger one because you're a priest and yet you hate me. So eventually he came in and said, right, I will forgive you if you forgive me. And we did that. And I came to the sacrament of reconciliation. And a weird thing happened after that. All of the IRA prisoners in the prison who knew me thought, he's nuts, he has gone mad. Who would open up this Bible? What Catholic would open up this Bible and give up the IRA? And in fact, very few would do that. And for about 7 or 8 years, the great majority of these tough guys who thought that bowing the knee or praying was for sissies, women, or people in fur, like the fur coat fuddy-duddies that they say go to church. And they sent me to Coventry for 7 or 8 years in the prison system. They made a law, don't talk to Shane, he's nuts, he's a Catholic. And the strange thing was that in this painful struggle to get back to real life, because sin had achieved 3 things in my life. It had cut me off from God in a way that I felt I couldn't even get through. I'd done too much harm. It cut me off from people, because I was in solitary confinement, cut off from the whole of society, and I was cut off from myself and peace within myself. So these 3 effects of sin, cut off from myself, cut off from other people, cut off from God, I was struggling very painfully to get through that. And, the great majority of people outside prison, frankly, didn't give a shit about me or other IRA prisoners or UDA prisoners or UDF prisoners. And the point was, it could have been a lot easier if people outside had practiced some of their faith towards people like us by helping us, writing, visiting, praying, or whatever. But anyway, in the great painful process to come to reconciliation and forgiveness, I did get help from people like Bishop Edward Daly, Cardinal Tommaso Fee, and a man that the press always said was mad, Frank Longford, Lord Longford, who visited the most outcast prisoners in the prison system. But anyway, having painfully come to this belief that I had been wrong, and that a man like me who didn't bow the knee easily should say sorry, and should actually bow the knee before God and men and actually pray, and so on, people reached out to me from where you are. And after 10 years in the English top security prison, I was sent back to Northern Ireland, to the prison system there for another 4.5 years. And I lived among a group of lost people, UVF, UDA, IRA, many of whom never heard from the people who professed to be Christians. They had no visits, no letters, nothing. And we became a very strange community, people who had grievously offended. And many of whom still felt and still feel that they're outside the mercy of God, that there is no rescue for them. And we formed this strange community of friendships, grew up, and we became the best of friends, people who formerly were murdering each other. And we often did it just sitting around reading the Gospels. And it was very hard for me to come out of prison after serving 14.5 years, go back to Derry, to manly men in the Bogside, and they would say, the bombs are here, the guns are here, and the Brits are still here. What are you going to do? And it was very hard for me to say, look, I'm following some very weird guy who says, love your enemies, whatever that means. Pray for your enemies. Do good to those who persecute you. It didn't come easily to me, and it still doesn't. But, many people in the prison system said I would never see the light of day, I would never see Ireland again, and I would never walk the streets again. And, here I am, and I give thanks for that. I'll have to shut up now. but I'm back on later on, so I'll see you later. Hello again. Back to I was going to start by telling you, that that when you're in the IRA and you're hearing a lot of criticisms from church people and politicians, that you should get your act together and give up what you're doing. You've got half an ear listening. So I had half an ear listening while I was bombing in Derry and on the border, and then went over to bomb London when I was 18. I had half an ear listening. But of course, the other ear and a half was deaf to all that. But I want to tell you a story about what happened when I began to listen, because when I began to listen, this is when I began to hear the response from other people. The first people to really help me when I was in solitary confinement and rotting in the prison system with 30 life sentences and 20 years were people like Bishop Edward Daly of Derry, Father Dennis Fall, Cardinal Tomas O'Fee, God rest him, and so on. So when I began to correspond, when I brought myself to swallow all my pride and bend the knee and write to this guy that I'd been slagging off for years in Derry, this Bishop Edward Daly, who was always on the back of the IRA, when I could see that he also had a little bit of good in him, I wrote to him, and said, look, I said awful things about you, slagged you off while you were slagging me off for what I was doing. And now I want to be friends with you, and I want to correspond with you, and I want you to help me, and I also want to be in contact with you. And I began to write to him, and we constantly corresponded for years, letter a week each way. And one of the priests in Derry, the only priest in Derry to visit prisoners in the prison system, none of the rest did, asked me to write a few notes after a couple of years for a sermon he was giving on Prisoner's Sunday in Derry. So I duly prayed, studied, and so on, wrote out a few notes. And he mentioned this before he read out some of my notes and some of his own. And some of the Catholics in Derry got up and walked out of the cathedral. And they went to him and said later, we don't want to hear anything from somebody who's a sinner. We don't want to hear anything from somebody who was a sinner. We don't want to hear anything from somebody who was in the IRA. So similarly, when I was in my prison cell alone, and studying the Gospels and trying to make some sense of it all, and feeling that I should write to my victims and apologize, I did so after a great struggle. And one of the people to whom I apologized for my attempt to injure him sold my letter of apology to the News of the World. And I'll never forget the headline, because it's the biggest read newspaper in the prison system in Britain. All the prisoners one Sunday morning came to my cell and said, haven't you made the right idiot of yourself? And I said, what are you talking about? And they said, look, you're the headline in the News of the World. And the headline was this wide, could barely fit on the page, and it was, anger as IRA bomber says sorry to the victims. Now, I was in the position of every prisoner in the system was saying to me, what's the matter with you, you nuts or what? What are you saying sorry to these people for? When you say sorry, they don't want to hear it. When you don't say sorry, they want you to say sorry. And there was a tremendous resistance in society and in many people. There was a resistance against the prodigal son getting back in the door and getting any kind of a party, and I didn't even want a party. I just wanted to be allowed to come and go. There was a tremendous judgment against people returning to the fold or coming back to the family or seeking the mercy and forgiveness, and there still is. And one of the unfortunate parts of my experience, both in prison and out of it, was that many good Christian people who were much better than, well, they were the best people, and I wasn't. They would frequently come to me and say, you don't really deserve to be here. Now, I would always have on the tip of my tongue the smart-ass, Derry, quick-fire response, which was, I'm entitled to come into to this vineyard late. I'm entitled to the same pay you get, even though I come at 5:30 or 29 minutes past. That's the weird deal from this weird guy who said he will seek out the lost sheep, and he will seek out the lost coin, and he'll bring me into the vineyard at the last minute before closing time and give me the same pay.
Now, I never said that, but I felt like saying it. And, you know, consider the many parents of the many prisoners in Portlaoise, in Longkesh, in Maghaberry, and the English prisons, who for years and years would be embarrassed that their son had bombed London, bombed Birmingham, bombed Belfast, bombed wherever. And they prayed and prayed and prayed in the background, I suppose, and hoped and hoped and hoped, and so did everybody else with them. But many people in the first year of my imprisonment, when I was a hardened IRA man and would not listen to anybody, because I was young and full of fire and anger and bitterness, still prayed for me. They could see beyond the state that I was then in to a state that they hoped would happen later. And they kept praying for me, kept supporting me, tried to visit me, tried to send me letters, and all this while I was unaware of all this. I was in solitary confinement, and I didn't know that there were people out there saying prayers or trying to send letters to me, which were returned by the prison system, who said, no, he's not supposed to get this letter. And I suppose I'm going the long way around to say that you cannot predict the future of Jerry Adams or the future of Davy Irvine or the future of Gusty Spence. And in a sense, that's like saying you cannot judge. And in a sense, I could not judge that I would never be here, although I never expected to be here. And the prison guards who tried to beat me up or maltreat me in solitary confinement never foresaw the day that I would be standing here. Nor did the Old Bailey court that gave me 30 life sentences and 20 years ever imagine that I would be here today. And in fact, nobody did. And yet here I am. So in a sense, you can't predict and you can't judge, although you may do so. But the fact is that even today, following the bombs, you know, there's a question of, do you give up hope? Do you give up faith? Do you give up working for people, helping people who are in prison or in paramilitaries? You know, the whole idea is that we should be sitting down and eating in some sense, or praying with people who are sinners, be they prostitutes or Pharisees or whatever they are. Who cares what the labels are? But I found in the prison system, and when I was coming out, and when I arrived in Trinity College, Dublin, to do a 4-year degree, that people were extremely judgmental. I mean, the average person would say, you know, he's not really a Christian. And what is really a Christian? Who knows? When you know, it's very hard to say. But there was a great, and there still is, a tremendous degree of judgment on people who are trying to get out of whatever it is they're in, be it drugs, addiction to drugs, addiction to, you know, to violence, addiction to paramilitaries. And many prisoners do not follow me where I have come from, because they say, we don't want that. Why should we go out and apologize and get slagged off in the papers for it? Why should we have prominent Catholics in our hometown saying, we don't want to hear this guy's story? You know, and there are many stories out there of the prodigal son coming home. And in fact, it's not so much that the family won't bring the prodigal son back, it's that the neighbors won't. You know, and we should not be obstacles to people like me trying to get back into life. And just to give you a quick snapshot, you know, I've been out 6 years. And in the 6 years, I went to Trinity, did a year postgrad, taught in schools for young travelers, founded the Big Issues magazine, and now work with the Jesuit Communication Centre in Leeson Street. And I've only ever had 1 or 2 parking tickets in 6 years. So, you know, but in other words, you just cannot judge. And in a sense, it's not for me to say that you shouldn't lose hope, but it is for me to say that somebody like me changed against all the odds, and I shouldn't really be here today, but I am. And nobody ever predicted that I would be here. So you guys shouldn't. You know, you guys should not give up hope. I mean, I presume that mercy, when it reaches me, and when I feel that I've had some mercy, when I feel that I can get away from this burden of being the London bomber with 30 life sentences, which is the way the press always refer to me, 6 years after I do this or do that, or write a best-selling book as I did, you know, about 2 years ago. I mean, they still say the bomber who did 30 life sentences and 20 years, you know. There comes a point at which you have to give people a break and hope that they improve. In fact, when you look in the mirror every morning to shave or wash your face, there's a point at which you hope that person also will improve in line with these other people that we marginalize. But in a sense, in my case, I learned the hard way in prison that when mercy arrives, there aren't any big rewards. The other IRA prisoners in the great majority rejected me. So I was in a situation for 8 years in solitary where the IRA rejected me because I'd become a Catholic. Mainstream Catholic Church didn't want me because I was an IRA bomber. Most church people wouldn't talk to me. The prison authorities hated me. And there were only 2 or 3 souls out there who would even talk to me, you know. And we should try and see that happening to people and go after these lost sheep and lost coins and so on. So that's one prayer I would like to leave you guys with tonight, but I'm still not finished yet. So moving on to, in the prison system, even though, well, when I first felt that I had gotten out of this great burden of guilt that I had for blowing people up, and I blew up people, and I blew up soldiers, and I blew up buildings, and I shot at soldiers with rifles and hoped to hit them, and sometimes did hit them. And at the time, I didn't even think about it. I was young, full of feistiness, and I thought, this is the way you free Ireland. Didn't they do it down south in 1916, 1918? My own uncle was in the old IRA, and he was a lieutenant colonel in the new Free State Army. He seemed to do okay out of it. And, you know, so the problem, you know, for me was this guilt hit me in prison. And most people said, you know, it's one of these prison conversions, it'll never last. He'll never see a Divine Mercy Conference. But the fact is, when I got rid of that guilt, when I wised up and listened to the many voices that were being raised to me, and when I read the Gospels and moved on to the point where I felt forgiveness, I felt that I didn't need the forgiveness of the people in the cathedral in Derry who walked out, rather than hear my few lines that I was asked to give by the priest. I didn't need their forgiveness, because I had forgiveness from on high, and it frankly didn't matter to me what people thought. I went ahead and did what I had to do. But even within the prison system, there is a hierarchy of the lost and the marginalized. The ultimate non-citizens in prison, and you would not want to be one of these. You would not want to be a sex offender of any sort, shape, or condition, because they are the most outcast within the prison system. They are regularly beaten up by other prisoners. They are regularly scalded by other prisoners, and the prison officers just turn a blind eye. They are regularly stabbed and beaten, particularly if their offense has involved children or women. Prisoners take it upon themselves to exact more punishment on these people. And it was, well, there's another group in there also, people who have made copious statements to the police, informers or supergrasses or grasses or snitches, whatever the word is. They are the most outcast, and everybody beats them up. They're available as scapegoats for any particular problems that might be happening in the prison. Somebody doesn't get a visit, somebody's wife doesn't write, somebody's radio doesn't work, they beat up a sex offender, or they beat up a grass or a supergrass. And it was unheard of for somebody like a political prisoner, and I was seen as a political prisoner, to ever talk to somebody who was gay, who was a sex offender, or who was a supergrass. And one of the Guildford Four, if you read his book, Jerry Conlon, was regarded by some of the IRA prisoners for some years as an informer who took secret visits from the special branch to help his father Giuseppe, who was an innocent man who died in prison. And prior to Giuseppe's death, when he was very ill, Jerry tried to get him out of prison, and he made up some nonsensical statements to the special branch in secret visits. The IRA prisoners found this out. He was cast into solitary confinement. That was the end of him at that time. IRA prisoners wouldn't talk to him. Nobody else would talk to him. And I wouldn't talk to him. He was in a cell on my wing, locked up all the time. And I, who had become this Catholic, still thought, you know, oh boy, there are still people outside the pale here. There are still people I will not talk to. And it was Giuseppe Conlon, his father, who came to me one day, some months before he died, and said, Shane, you're this so-called Catholic, and my son is in solitary and he's innocent, and you're guilty, and you're refusing to talk to him. The IRA won't let him out of the cell onto the wing. They're going to beat him up or kill him or something. Why don't you do something about it? So I went away and thought about it and thought, he's right. I am a hypocrite, and as Jerry outlines in his book very briefly, I went to the IRA and said, you're wrong. He may be an alleged informer, but he's not. You have it wrong, he's in solitary and so on. You should let this man out of solitary. And they said, no way, we've taken a vote. Everybody must obey. And I said, well, I'm not going to obey it because his father wants me to talk to him. So when he's released from his prison cell to walk up to the hot plate to get his meal, surrounded by prison officers for his own safety, and this happened to Jerry Conlon, no one would ever talk to him. We would turn away in prison. So on the next day he got out, I talked to him, and I told the English prisoners, who were the great majority, this man is totally innocent, and he should not be being treated this way. Now, what I'm trying to say to you is, there are many people today in society who think, it's fine, the guy standing up at the microphone looks okay, he ain't so bad, he works for the Jesuit Communication Center, we can accept him and forgive him. Insofar as anybody here has a right to forgive me, you might feel he's okay, we'll forgive him. But in prison, I caused outrage when I began to talk to the sex offenders, who weren't much, you know, they hadn't blown people up or shot people, but absolutely nobody would talk to them. Nobody ever visited them, nobody ever wrote to them. And I began to talk to the supergrasses, and nobody ever talked to them. So everybody thought I'd gone completely crazy. And I began to talk to Jerry Conlon. But worst of all in the prison system, because the big scare about AIDS and HIV came out in the early 80s, I began to talk to gay prisoners. And of course, gays, even for many people here, are the most outcast people in the world because they're stuck in sin. Now, the rest of us might be stuck in all kinds of sins, private or otherwise, hidden, secret or otherwise, but, you know, I always felt, and I often said it to churchmen as well, if I can get mercy and I blew people up and I bombed and I gave warnings and I wrecked London and I wrecked Derry and I wrecked the border, and you can forgive me, how come we can't go one step further and forgive the sex offenders, be they priests or be they not priests? And how come, you know, we can't forgive gay people who want back into the family? But it's not so popular to go to a microphone and say, hey, I haven't bombed London, but I was gay. And the point is, the marginalized, you know, we're supposed to be eating and supping and helping those who are sinners. We're all sinners. So why should we stop with the most popular people? In fact, why should we ever stop? Be there war or be there peace, there are still prisoners. And be there a so-called peace, there are still people in paramilitaries with guns and drugs. So I never saw any reason for stopping the flow of mercy because it looked after me. And in fact, who knows where mercy is going? Surely it should go everywhere. But why should somebody make a decision that it stops here and doesn't go there? Who's got the right to do that? You know, and then you might say, well, who's got a right not to pray for somebody? Is there somebody around who's not deserving of prayer? Or is there somebody around who's not deserving of help? Just call it help. Call it compassion. Call it mercy. Is there anybody you can think of who, like Patrick O'Donnell, who allegedly murdered the woman and her child and the priest? Is somebody like the most outcast person? Or Father Brenton Smith, the person who's dumped into the prison system? Who wants to visit Father Brenton Smith? Why would anybody want to visit a sex offender? You know, it's not popular. It's more popular to talk to Jerry Adams. And a gay person said to me one time, when a newspaper was criticizing this prominent gay person who was a Catholic, said to me, Shane, I can't figure it out. You blew people up, you bombed, you shot, you wrecked the place, you got your 30 life sentences, and they're all talking to you. But I was born gay, and nobody's talking to me. Nobody prays with me, nobody comes to offer me any mercy or support or love, and I couldn't answer the question. So the question's still in my head, why do we stop the flow of mercy somewhere and say, let's just deal with the acceptable, with the acceptable sinner? And I learned the hard way that there's no such thing as stopping the flow of mercy or love wherever it goes. So I was asked to say, okay, so this guy hears this message that we're all trying to shove in his ear for years. So what difference does it make? What difference does it make to me? Well, the difference it made for me was when I came out of prison, I had to decide what I was going to do. Many prisoners come out of prison and there's nothing there for them in their local community or village or town. Nobody wants to know. So they go back to their organization, which gives them a golden handshake of a few quid or whatever, gets them a job, and they stay within the organization because they never got any welcome anywhere else. So both in prison when I left the IRA, I just was on my own for years. And when I was moved back to Northern Ireland after 10 years in England, nobody in the Northern Ireland prison system would talk to me either, except some outcast UVF and UDA people who were in the same boat that I was in. So I ended up in this strange wing in Northern Ireland. Most of the prisons are controlled by the IRA, the UDA, and the UVF. And there was one other wing for weirdos like me who didn't belong in any organization because nobody wanted me. And I was stuck on this wing with prominent UVF, UFF, UDA guys who were supposed to hate Catholics, and they had murdered between them a couple of dozen Catholics in Belfast and Portadown and the border. And I walked onto this wing one day after being transferred back from England wondering, am I going to be alive at tea time? Are these orange bees going to murder me? And of course they were all looking at me saying, oh my God, there's that Fenian bee and he's going to murder us, And we were all quaking and fearing and so on. And these guys from the first day in the prison system in Northern Ireland in 1985 when I was moved back, these loyalist guys looked after me. They saw that I had tea bags and so on. The Republican prisoners were too embarrassed to talk to me because I had done the unforgivable thing. I'd left the organization. So the loyalists were looking after me. And then the IRA guys, many of them who weren't in the IRA, but they just stayed on the IRA wings, they began to look after me too. And we all began to talk about things that we'd never talked about before. For instance, I knew like one guy in the UFF who killed Catholics, and he was a picture image of Martin McGuinness, and he hated to hear it. But we looked alike, we were the same. We weren't educated in the same schools, and we never met socially. And some of my friends in prison, the first Protestant they ever met was when they shot one dead. And some of my Protestant friends, the first Catholic they ever met was when they shot one dead. And that's the kind of society we gave these young people, and then we cast them into prison and we never pray for them again. We never work for them again, we never visit them again, or we never send them letters again. So people say, you know, so what difference has it made to you? Well, some years ago, the first trip that Gusty Spence ever made to the Republic of Ireland, and he was the leader of the UVF, was about 5 years ago. It was the first trip he made in 35 years, and he came down to a platform in the Gresham Hotel here to talk about peace with me long before any ceasefire, and long before it was popular to talk to paramilitaries. So in my own life, I went to Trinity, got a degree, did a year postgrad, taught in schools for young travelers, founded the Big Issue magazine with some other people, and now I work in the Jesuit Communications Center. So I was only going to say to you that, you know, when you read about somebody or hear about somebody, or when somebody says to you, oh, this will never be solved, nobody can say that. Nobody can predict the future. Just as you can't predict your own future, you can't predict mine. You know, and if you don't like paramilitary prisoners coming back to the fold, or sexual prisoners, or Brenton Smiths, or Brenton Comiskys, well, you might like them coming back, but don't obstruct them coming back, because they've got the same rights in the vineyard as you guys have. In fact, probably more, because they're more welcome as prodigal sons than the good people who don't need a party and a fatted calf and so on. So anyway, I was just going to... Well, I was just going to say, you know, that I haven't really got much more to say, since I suppose I gave what they call a testimony earlier, but I was going to tell you a story that I wanted you to think about, you know, when you hear about a bomb going off. When I was only a kid of 15 and a half or 16, I was given a rocket launcher and told in Derry, go out and fire it at that sandbag post, and I was delighted. It was everything I wanted to do and be, an IRA hero. So I went out and fired the rocket at the sandbag post at the time. And it missed, of course, because I was young and didn't know how to use this thing. And it went over it and traveled about half a mile and landed near another army checkpoint in the city, because it's a small city. And it exploded. And the soldiers there were so shocked that they shot at the first car that had just driven away from the checkpoint. And there was a woman in the car with 2 children, and all 3 of them were riddled with bullets, and they were critically injured. And I didn't hear about it until later on, when the IRA OC came to me and said, what the hell did you hit with that rocket? And I said, nothing. And he said, well, he opened up in a car, there's a woman and 2 children critically injured by bullets and so on. And I remember, you know, young tough guy who thought, you know, prayers for fuddy-duddies and people in fur coats at mass and so on, not for me. And the first thing I did that night when I got home was down on my knees the whole night through, praying for this woman and her 2 kids to be saved from death because of the bullets that the soldiers fired and because of the rocket that I fired, you know. Now, there wouldn't have been anybody in the country who would have imagined, first of all, that the rocket was fired by a 15-and-a-half-year-old or a 16-year-old. And secondly, there wasn't anybody who'd have believed that that person who fired the rocket would have been down on his knees praying that night. And thirdly, there was nobody around at the time who felt it was worthwhile to go to a group of people who were doing the wrong thing and try and talk to them. It wasn't the done thing. Priests were standing a mile back from the then IRA people, whom they knew well. In a small community like Derry, everybody knew he was in the IRA, but there was a kind of a ban on talking to these public sinners. And for years, nobody talked. And when I wrote a book called The Volunteer, which was on the bestseller list 2 years ago, number 3, and it's still available in the shops, I put an argument in there saying, how come nobody's talking to sinners? I thought that's what it was all about. I thought that Democrats were supposed to sell them democratic politics, and I thought that Christians were supposed to be selling them something even better, with an eternal reward. So, and I was arguing, you know, go out and talk to these guys in the UVF and UDA and IRA. And it was something new, you know, but yet 2,000 years ago, JC was already doing this kind of thing, sitting with prostitutes and sinners, and it seemed to be some new kind of a message, shocking message. And some of the newspapers, when they read my book, slagged off this idea that you should go out and talk to sinners or eat with them, and so on and so forth. But I was only going to say, you know, that if there's one thing I would come away from here from, like I've met some people who are just as weird as I am here. They've come up to me to talk to me, and they've got weird stories, and you know, they're here. So, you know, if there's one thing that I would remember, there's some strange people here that I never thought would be here. And, you know, so who knows who's going to be here next year? You know, maybe I can bring some people down from Derry or Belfast who never thought they'd be here. Maybe you can. You know, maybe during the year we would all do something more to invite more people here who should be here. The marginalized, the isolated, the outcast. That's if we have any message to offer them. Maybe we do, and maybe we don't, you know. Listen, I was going to thank you for listening to me, and thank you for coming here. And I'll see you again next year, if not tomorrow anyway. Thanks very much.